microphone works this time. Sorry if you're just logging in from the beginning to watch this back, but throughout. And I have 2V. You can hear me? Please let me know if you can. Lord of the Woods. Spring. This is a light-hearted and raunchy 10K comedy fantasy between a trans dressmaker and a mischievous spirit of the wood. Stream will be available to view after if you can't come along live. Okay. Seeing more people. More people is good. Hopefully everybody can still hear me. And I have my editor open in Discord who will tell me, even if nobody else tells me in the chat. I hope. Hope everybody's having a good evening, better than mine. I am heard. That's all I've ever wanted. It's grand. Show up, and I just realized I shared the wrong link on Patreon. Everything's fine. Everything will be fine. Nothing could ever go wrong. Friday. I noticed, by the way, that I misspelled reading in the title, and I am upset about it, but not enough to try and edit it, because the last time I tried to edit it, I think, is when my microphone stopped working. So I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to. Hope everybody's enjoying the weather, whatever it's like where you are. Here, it is 21 degrees. My asthma is bad, but I might take it again in the course of this live stream. And it is humid and sticky. It's working! Yay! If you guys can, please do retweet the link on Twitter. It is gross and humid, yeah. Everywhere, just all over, just for everybody. It's the 2 minutes to allow people to filter in, and then we'll begin, and then we'll begin. Find the link. There we go. Aye. Oh, by the way, tell me if you can hear me drinking, because I know it's a sensitive microphone, but I know that's gross. I can't fix it. If you can. That's me. It's all good. Wonderful. Thank you. If I just, when I do these regularly, I'll get better at them. We'll get better at them. It'll go along more smoothly, easier. Everything will get easier. Everything will be fine. I'll be right back. I'm going to get my inhaler. Oh, my headphones tangled in my glasses. Hearty, if not healthy. Just an old man and wheezy, as you can imagine. But yeah, I'm thinking, oh no, my hair. But I'm thinking that I'll start these sort of regularly on Fridays, probably around the same time. I feel like 9 p.m. is like a good medium between the Americans and not staying up. I know that there's a way to like schedule it so that it shows before I start streaming, which I know as of about 20 minutes ago, and I discovered it by accident. Maybe I'll do that, maybe not, but subscribe maybe if you get notifications in case I forget to put it on Twitter. But then you should be notified, I think, because you'll be able to watch live streams back. Yes. So on the 10-minute mark, I'll start reading. And then I think everybody can. The lag between my being live and your hearing it. Okay. The Lord of the Woods Spring Bride is about 10,000 words in the middle, somewhere where it feels sensible. It's a rated M. It is raunchy, but not explicit. Try to be over the age of 18, and if you can't manage it just yet, you shouldn't be here. And the story is lighthearted, but just note content warnings for a trans man being outed in public. He doesn't find it like trauma in terms of anti-Romani sentiment and homophobic. But that all is there and happens. So consider yourself forewarned. That I'm starting to read now. All of this will get smoother. All of this will get easier. It's just practice. Everything's fine. I accidentally closed the tab. Give me a second. It's fine. I don't see why we couldn't just drive, muttered Rosalind, and Pothos laughed under his breath, tipping her chin up so that he could get a better look at the Mercy. And for all the horses towing their caravan were large, moved smoothly. She was a delicate thing, prim and built like a doll with short limbs and porcelain features, and a huge ruffled skirt made her look even smaller. Of the 4 girls in the caravan, she was the one that Pothos thought likely to rank last. Not that his lordship actually produced a leaderboard, but he'd studied the notes Mrs. Carpathian had made each spring, and he rather thought he had a good understanding by now. Charge, and I'm afraid a car without a battery wouldn't be too much use. That's not my battery, okay. Have you been an attendant for an awfully long time, Pothos? Asked Roberta, a tall woman with strong cheekbones. He couldn't decide if she'd rank second or third. He liked her dress, but not for the occasion. It was an A-line thing with a round neck and a tight skirt, and he knew just by looking at her that she was going to struggle when it came to the dance. I'm not an attendant, I'm afraid, miss. His lordship's retinue call on me each spring to help you young ladies dress and make up your faces. I'm afraid I can't claim any loyalty to his lordship particularly. I'm grateful for his regular employment of my services more than I am his godly virtues affecting my garden to bloom, as I own 2 cacti precisely, and my thumbs are more black than green. But I've been repairing the priestess's dresses for 9 years. And repair? Asked Carrie. She was the one that Pothos would bet his money on taking his lordship's crown of snowdrops and catmint. A plump girl of above average height, she filled out her dress very nicely, and through the lace finishing that came loose from the caps at her shoulders, one could see the heavy muscle in her arms. She was a baker by occupation, and his lordship well loved in a woman to see the signs of how she spent her days. She struck Pothos as almost painfully innocent, so much so that he almost couldn't believe she wasn't putting on an act of being the naïf, but that would only work in her favour. I'm afraid they get torn in all sorts of things, miss, said Pothos, was met with measured neutrality in his tone, and he rather enjoyed the primness of Cariad's O-shaped lips, her head, but it was artfully done, he felt. The last of the 4 was at first glance a simple-looking girl. She was beautiful in a simple way, beautiful like a statue. Her plump lips had a neat curve to them. Her cheeks were round, her eyes deep-set and dark. She didn't speak her favour, being as he designed her dress. It was a peplos dyed in deep purple. Fresh flowers embroidered last night through the shoulder, and against the deep brown of her skin they looked very fine. He wanted her to win, even though he didn't think she would. I imagine they're rather pleased to give you the work, Penelope said, or at least pleased to have had the satisfaction of making it. Pothos laughed and dusted the last of the blush onto Rosalind's cheeks. Rosalind was sitting up straight, her hands folded in her lap, and when Pothos turned the mirror toward her, she smiled. Why must you come with us? Asked Roberta. Sorry to have me here, Pothos, and Roberta grinned at him, making him laugh. I don't wish to make you ladies nervous, but I'm here to attend in the case that anybody has a wardrobe malfunction or makes their makeup run. This is from smudging his work. I shouldn't worry about it, he said good-naturedly. It doesn't happen every year. Yes, it did. And there are 3 parts to the contest, asked Cariad, and Pothos chuckled. What has Mrs. Carpathian told you? That there are 3 rounds, said Rosalind. A dance first, and then a conversation. And then she said that the last of the rounds is when he makes a selection that is tailored to the mood of the evening. In short, everything she told us has been very vague, said Penelope dryly. And you think I might give you more precise advice? Asked, resting one hand over his belly. He was the Lord of the Woods spring wedding, and today was no exception. He was dressed in one of his more finely tailored suits, the jacket cropped at the waist, the shirt worn open to show the shape of his neck and the pendants resting in the hollow of his collarbone. It was still growing, and cinched to show how narrow his waist was. It was very good business when they saw him so well dressed and collected. Of the 30 spring brides he'd attended to these past years, 20 of them had been in contact for repairs or additions, and 6 of them had commissioned wholly new additions, always led to a horny audience, and he'd like to come out of it with a few dates at least. I'm sorry to disappoint you, he said mildly. I'm afraid I'll stay in the caravan while you 4 take part in the ceremonies. There should be 5 of you, of course, but I'm afraid Lavinia, your counterpart, was taken ill and couldn't join us. You're staying here? Asked Carrie. Hurt your feelings, miss, when I tell you that young ladies cavorting through the flowers is rather the opposite of what I'm interested in. I'll be in here if any of you need me, today and tomorrow. Wake me in the middle of the night if it pleases you. I'm here to serve. When they arrived, Pothos got out of the caravan first, pulling out the step-ladder so that he could help each of the young women down, particularly Rosalind, whose short legs were hardly made for coming out of a big cart like this one. The wagon had come to rest under a canopy of rambling roses that grew around a frame for the horses, where they could rest and eat something. The dawn would still not break for another half an hour, and the wood was dark, but not forebodingly so. Lights were strung between each of the boughs, creating a well-lit little marketplace. Already Pothos could see people milling about. There were the priests and priestesses of the nearby wood tent wares to the spectators, sponge sugar and edible flowers, popcorn and all things of that nature. The people from the nearby villages had or so, accumulating in the stands around the clearing. Pothos didn't like to watch the ceremonies themselves. He'd watched the first year he'd come to offer his services, and he'd always found them strangely brutal. The Lord of the Wood was a capricious thing. Every spring he selected a bride from the surrounding area with whom he would usher in the new year, and though through her his goodwill was spent. He'd seen the new brides, each of them. They all but glowed with the Lord's spirit coursing through them, eyes shining like beacons, flowers bloomed where they walked. It was quite the honour, Pothos was informed, although he imagined one would have to invest a great deal of money in relaying one's carpets if one had them, which he did, and he was very fond of them. He chose he was biased, not being used to the English paganism himself. The dance seemed forthright enough, not complicated so much as long, but after that what Mrs. Carpathian called a conversation, and what Pothos thought might be more accurately called a steal of wills. He'd had conversations with Hellenist priests in one temple or another at a temple dinner. He'd been young and starry-eyed, but he'd still held his own quite well in the conversation, and Lord Dionysus had even given him a charm that he still kept hanging in his bedroom. One always had to conduct oneself carefully with any divinity, Pothos had been taught. But at least the ones he pledged himself to were straightforward enough. Oh, my battery's running low. Oh, fuck. Sorry. Oh. I mean, you're plugged in, so what? One moment. I'm just going to get under my desk. Had to conduct oneself carefully with any divinity, Pothos had been trying to trap you unless you'd already done something wrong. And they certainly did. Each conversation Pothos had witnessed would-be bride had been more upsetting than the last. He'd only seen 2 of them in their entirety, given that he'd kept having to go and fix the last one's makeup. It was meant to be a back and forth, a dance for 2 instead of the group dance. They matched his every step around the circle, and for every barb or word he aimed at them, they were meant to reply. He'd say the most dreadful things Pothos had ever heard, the poor girls contesting for his favour. Insult their appearances, their minds, their clothes, their families, and he always seemed to know exactly what would hurt them most. There were different methods Mrs. Carpathian had said she'd seen over the 2 decades or so she'd presided over the event. You could be extraordinarily humble, thank the Lord for every insult, as though it were a compliment, and curtsy for each of them, or reply that each of them was a compliment in truth. You could ignore them, or pick out a small piece of each statement to misinterpret and discuss. If you were very brave, you could insult his lordship in kind. Mrs. Carpathian said she was under the impression that his lordship, like the women that did that, knew debutantes for each year. There could easily be older women, but he was under the impression that the committee's selection was a hotly political affair and had as much to do with the popularity of each girl's parents as it did their qualities, and most of them couldn't stand to insult a spirit like him face to face. She'd called it a painfully English affair once. Mrs. Carpathian herself was a but she said that there was no sense in tilting at windmills. An ivy, roofed with tree branches, was carried into the centre of the clearing, and into it stepped his lordship. One by one, the brides would step inside with him, sometimes for as little as a few minutes, sometimes for as long as half an hour, and emerge again. Sometimes they would emerge tearful and infuriated. Other times they would come out with their clothes ruffled and their lips bruised from kissing. Sometimes they came out with no marks on them at all. These latter, according to Mrs. Carpathian, were winners more often than not. "Did they give you any trouble?" asked the lady in question as Pothos walked back toward the caravan and he offered her his arm. She curled her hand around his elbow, leaning into him. She was a big-boned woman with strong muscle on her, tall. She was an archer and he'd seen her speed on horseback. And when she leaned into him, the side of her jaw touched against the top of his head. Not at all. They were remarkably well behaved, all 4 of them, although it did seem strange for me to be in with 4 instead of 5. As I recall, young Miss Picard had the most complex dress, what with all the petals woven through lace. Add to her soreness. Do I detect a level of sadism in your voice, Mrs. Carpathian? Being ill on the morning she used to present herself to the Lord of the Wood, Mrs. Carpathian said scathingly, clucking her tongue. It's a disgrace. I doubt she's sick just to spite him. More's the pity, she said. If she don't despite him, I might respect it more. Mrs. Carpathian stood in the doorway of the caravan as he pushed the doors open wider, climbing the step ladder. at home in a caravan, aren't you? Asked Mrs. Carpathian. Want to toss in a racial epithet while you're at it? Asked Porthos evenly. Did I say anything? Asked Mrs. Carpathian, with a sort of smug smile, and he rolled his eyes, hooking his foot around the armchair's foot and pulling it where the light would land. The driver had already tugged the horses away, and the caravan was resting on bricks to keep it static. You remind me of a teacher I had at school, said Porthos idly, pushing open the chest pinned in its place and taking out the dress he'd been working on earlier that morning, setting it on the chair for him to work on. Oh, anything. And how? Asked Mrs. Carpathian. You, asked Mrs. Carpathian. I am not pledged to anybody, said Porthos, but I wear symbols of Hestia, her cateress, and the charities. There are other icons in the house, of course, and the shop. Not hermaphrodite at the end of the caravan, looking down at her. Perhaps he'd be upset, wasn't used to the occasional. Did you start on my blood and my family? Said Porthos, resting his chin on his hands. Now you start on my gender. One begins to wonder, Mrs. Carpathian, if the insults are really about me at all. She crossed her arms over her chest, looking away from him into the growing market. Her lips thinned. What does fuss mean? You are English, she demanded, which with her thick Breton accent was funny more than insulting. He gave her a flat look. Yes, I know what the words pantheon to which I'm pledged, Mrs. Carpathian, but no divinity in dry household. Fusses. I don't believe that, she said snootily, and he huffed out a laugh. He likes to have 5, she said. It should be. I've tried, she muttered. There aren't as many applicants as there used to be, you know, and the others from this year are quite unsuitable. We struggled to pick 5 of them. Will the sky fall if you pick one of last year's rejects? Probably, she muttered coolly, and amusedly he shook his head. Seems you're in a pickle then, he said. Can't say I envy you. Will you fix one up if we find her? I can do her makeup, said Porthos. If you get back to me in the next 20 minutes with a girl in the right dress, I might tailor it to her before the proceedings start, she asked, seeming surprised by the question, and considered it a moment. No, she decided. No, he doesn't harm anybody. He doesn't have it in him. He didn't have it in him to hold back a snort of derision. I think he rather does. Oh, tears and hurt feelings aren't harm, she said dismissively. You don't get to admire a rose and complain of the thorns it pricks you with. But he might refuse to go ahead with it. Fascinated, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the posts. Refuse? What, not have a bride at all? Won't all the farms and flowers wither away in the vicinity? Not entirely, she said, but they certainly won't be abundant, and we'll all suffer for the loss. It's more reward. I wish you luck then, he said. Mrs. Carpathian looked at him. His lordship is no patron of mine, but I live on his land, and I pay him the tithes owed when the collectors come. I might not worship him, but that isn't to say I don't respect him or your worship of him. She gave him a funny look. I don't think I'll ever understand you, Mr. Hearn. I don't think I want you to, Mrs. Carpathian, he said pleasantly. I'll bring the girls their slippers in a moment. Get them to take their shoes off, would you? Especially that she's in her wellies and they exactly match her white lace dress. Snorting and shaking her head, Mrs. Carpathian bustled along the walkway, and he heard her bark. 2 hours later, each of his lordship's spring brides had had their shoes replaced with ribbon slippers, not back in his armchair, sat in the office of his storefront in Yeovil proper, and was hand-sewing pearls into a bridal skirt. He didn't do wedding dresses very often and outings, and he only did wedding dresses for families interested in a proper heirloom. But this one was a pleasant challenge, and he didn't mind that it was dull, set aside so that he was only sat with his waistcoat over his sleeves, and the sun trickled warm over his arms and his chest, made him feel like a snake basking on a rock without sweating. He was distantly but knit. The caravan might not compare to his Aunt Mercy's still impeccably appointed bardo, which took his breath away whenever he saw it drawn up by her horse Cabbage, but it was beautiful. Most of his cousins' caravans were nice in their own right. For one, they had electricity, which he somewhat missed sitting in a wagon like this. Certainly every year he didn't miss faffing about with the oil lamps if he wanted to keep sewing once the sun had gone down, or comfort any of the crying girls, worried it would answers if they went to the priestesses, but it was only 2 a year. He was smiling to himself as he sewed, remembering how he used to get excited whenever they were coming through and would settle on the orchard for a few weeks, as much as it always led to arguments about religion, about space, about cleanliness, about rules, about clothes, about everything but apples, and sometimes those too. It was funny how remembering his mother and aunts shouting at one another made him feel strangely homesick, but it did. And he remembered how any of them could say cupping any child's cheeks and telling them to go play or to go eat. It served a man very well in tailoring, to learn to wield one's tongue and one's temper at that. "There's going to be trouble," said Sam. He had come to stand at the foot of the wagon steps, and he was holding a newspaper under his arm, scowling out at the marketplace. More and more spectators were arriving, filtering down the path and into the forest, and Pothos raised an eyebrow, driving them. And just to look at him, Pothos could see how uncomfortable he was in the ridiculous uniform the priestesses forced him into every year, picking and plucking at the braces, keeping the trousers up to his waist. And Pothos half thought Sam's favourite part of it was taking off his clothes. "Something awful in the paper?" Sam glanced down at the paper in his hand and then shook his head. "Nay, not in paper. With his lordship, I mean. There's going to be trouble, don't you doubt it." "How could I?" Ed, clucking his tongue disapprovingly. "There'll be trouble," he said again. Ross cursed as he shoved his needle through his finger. Immediately he wrenched his hand away from the cloth in his lap. A bit of torn thread could be replaced, but there was nothing so awful as getting blood out of white fabric. "You all right?" asked Sam to one side. He'd shoved the needle right into the flesh of his middle finger, luckily at an angle so that it went through the soft flesh instead of going down toward the nerve and bone, and he wrinkled his nose as he pulled the needle out, washing it under the flow of the tap. "Is it very bad?" asked Sam. "No, it's only a needle. Could have been worse with the stitch unpicker." Sam wrinkled his nose, and Pothos grinned to himself, rubbing his thumb over his bleeding finger as it stayed under the water, waiting for the tiny wound to scab. "The first aid kit's on that shelf there. Would you get me a plaster?" "You need one?" Sam asked, but didn't hesitate in obeying. "It's going to be an awkward scab, and I'll keep ripping it off." The ground had stopped quaking, but there was an impossible, rageful noise coming from further down the valley, and Pothos and Sam shared a look. "Trouble," said Sam, with more caution than triumph. "Trouble is right," said Pothos, picking up his emergency case, containing another first aid kit, some sewing supplies, and a great deal of makeup, and stepping onto the path. "Come on." They walked under the archways of ramblones and tall wooden stands that went into the tree line, with more balconies and viewing platforms in the trees themselves, which were very tall. The clearing was appointed in such a way that above them the canopy was round, and only a perfectly round disc in the centre let in the summer night. Tomorrow afternoon, when the sun was directly overhead, the winning bride would be bathed in golden light, and the Lord of the Wood would come to embrace her. If it went ahead, that was. The Lord of the Wood did not ordinarily, to Pothos, look like a deity. He looked no different to most forest nymphs and some fae as he'd ever seen, but inhuman. He was 6'5" or 6, with strong brown as an oak too, with grey undertones to it, and it was smooth and free of markings. His long, dark waves of hair hung loose around his shoulders, and through it grew pieces of ivy and sprouted a natural crown of oak leaves. And the tunic was made of woven moss and twine rope. The rest of him were glowing a dangerous gold that looked more at home in a blacksmith's forge than a forest, and when he shouted, it made every tree quake and shift, the stands stuttering. "Only 4, he roared. As he paced, Pothos noted the singed marks his feet left in the grass. Mrs. Carpathian, to her credit, was not even flinching as he shouted at her, but Pothos could see that she was tense as a bowstring, her shoulders stiff. "Do you do this to insult me?" demanded the Lord of the Wood. "No, Lord. That's worse, then," he immediately interrupted her, eyes ablaze. I might move smoothly over to the 4 maidens waiting for the ceremony. The 5th seat between Rosalind and Cariad looking devastatingly empty. Arms for them to lean on. Oh, no, I'm sorry about the signal. Hope it's watchable. Rosalind was really teary-eyed, a fearful expression that Pothos was quite certain in this case was not manufactured at all. Roberta and Penelope were faring better, Penelope sitting straight with her expression calculatedly neutral. Roberta with a slight frown on her lips, but Pothos could see that they were at ease too. Not to worry, lady, he said gently, taking a handkerchief from his pocket and deftly wiping at the base of Rosalind's eyes. I'm sure Mrs. Carpathian will sort it all out for you. He noticed taking out a white spool of thread and needle. I've never seen him shout before, whispered Rosalind, and then flinched when his lordship shouted a few words that vibrated with magical power, sending them thrumming through each of them their chests. Nor have I, said Pothos evenly. Has a tremendous set of pipes on him, doesn't he? Rosalind stared at him in baffled shock, but at least got a weak smile out of Roberta and a slight uplifting of Penelope's lips. Cariad, focused entirely on the Lord of the Wood, didn't seem to have heard. He touched her arm. The other way, would you? I'm going to repair this little tear for you. Do I need to take it off? No, just stay still so I don't poke you, said Pothos with a comforting smile, and Cariad nodded, leaning the other way. Pothos leaned into her. It only took 2 or 3 neat little stitches, but it should keep the skirt in place for the rest of the day's proceedings, and he checked the waistband for more. Fucking horrid dress that it was, he supposed he shouldn't be surprised that it was poorly made as well. Lean forward, Cariad, he said. He had tuned out the shouting quite naturally, and for all its supernatural volume, he didn't realise it had stopped until he tore the end of the stitch up and sat up. Until he tore the end of the stitch and sat up. The silence in the clearing was thick and oppressive, and he froze like a rabbit in headlights, his needle still in hand, as he stood stock still, lips pressed together, and his fiery eyes were so fiery now that he was fairly certain he could see smoke, actual smoke, coming out of his ears. Pothos swallowed. I beg your pardon, Lord, he said, hurriedly stepping down from the stool and crouching to put his needle and thread away, hoping it might be read as genuflection. I was only— Get up, said the Lord of the Wood. It'd be better to run away. He grasped hold of Pothos by the side of his neck to haul him forward, and Pothos shuddered at the impossible heat of his hand, at the heat that radiated from his body as Pothos was dragged closer. Who are you? My name is Pothos Hearn, Lord, he said. I take care of their wardrobes. Wardrobes, repeated the Lord of the Wood, and Pothos found he couldn't look right into his eyes because they blazed too brightly to be looked at directly. He stared instead at the Lord's mouth, at his sharp teeth, his red tongue. Mr. Hearn dresses the brides each year and does their makeup, Lord, said Mrs. Carpathian. He isn't in seriously. His fingers didn't feel quite so hot as they trailed down the side of his jaw, touching his chin and tilting his head to the other side. Don't you? Yes, Lord, said Pothos. I live on the road to Mudford Sock. How long have you painted my bride's faces for? 6 years, Lord. You painted the one with ivy and flowers? Pothos blinked, lips parting, closing. They got brides like that. A few years ago, a girl with a tattoo on her cheek of hearts had made the committee furious when she'd refused to have it covered up with makeup. Pothos had liked her, Jerry. She'd won that year, too. I do whatever the brides ask me, Lord, said Pothos. The temple hires me, but I style the brides as they wish to be styled, whatever that might entail. This one, said the Lord of the Wood to Mrs. Carpathian. Mrs. Carpathian stared at the Lord with her lips pressed together and her eyes very wide, an expression of strained, stressed shock that Pothos expected found its mirror in his own face right about now. My lord? She asked. This one, said the Lord of the Wood. My 5th bride. Pothos stared at the members of the committee, some locals from different village halls, a mix of magical ones and mixed ones. My lord, said Mrs. Carpathian, delicately. Mr. Hearn is rather older than the others, and he isn't one of our temple, and he's a man, said one of the committee members, a bespectacled woman with badly dyed hair. The Lord of the Wood looked back to Pothos, and Pothos saw his eyes had faded to their usual colour, the same smooth, creamy brown as an acorn's. Demanded loudly, and never too much anger, he said, I don't ordinarily like to shout it out at parties, Lord, but as I do. Your womb is in good working order? Porthos felt, you're not so old, you're of breeding age. How kind, Porthos said through teeth. Him, said the Lord of the Wood again, turning to Mrs. Carpathian and her committee, several of whom were in an apparently new light, which he detested on every level. I want him. It was difficult to focus on flattery at a time like this, but Porthos did try his best. None of the women he dressed in the past 6 years had been older than 25, most of them 22 at the eldest. He liked to think he was handsome, and men certainly liked to tell him he was. Testosterone had been even better to him than his own genes as far as his face, improving drastically on what he'd already felt was pretty good. Even the phrasing of his second question was a clue to his suitability. The Lord of the Wood didn't need someone who was fertile, per se, just someone with a womb that could carry something. Will you refuse? Asked the Lord of the Wood, looking curious as to the answer, and Porthos raised his eyebrows. Now, everyone would blame me for the result if the event didn't go ahead. The Lord of the Wood smiled. It was a mischievous smile, and it was handsome, hot, in a dangerous, frightening way, and Porthos cursed the way it made his heart skip a beat. It doesn't bother you that I'm a Hellenist? The Lord of the Wood's hand dipped down, curling a finger around the necklaces hanging around Porthos's neck, folding them in his hand to examine them. He slid his thumb first over the peploy. You're a weaver, he said, sounding pleased. You wear more symbols than these of your gods? I have tattoos. I look forward to seeing them, said the Lord of the Wood, and set Porthos's pendants back against his neck, returning them gently before turning back to the committee. Why the preparation not complete? He demanded. He handed him his own slippers. This is your fault, he told her as he undid his boots. No. Porthos snorted and pulled off his socks. Do you think I should lace them over my anklets, or should I take them off and put them again on top? Oh, you wear anklets, said Mrs. Carpathian in dismay. As if the committee didn't hate you enough. I rather get the impression I was chosen to spite them, muttered Porthos, and handed the silver chains to her as he laced up each shoe. Do you know the dance, Mr. Hearn? Asked Rosalind beside him. No, said Porthos. I suppose, if anything, one can spin it as a sort of radical trans inclusion. Mrs. Carpathian sniggered and put his anklets on for him as he laced up the other shoe. Do you think you'll win? Asked Cariad. I hope not, said Porthos, thinking despairingly of his carpets, and began to roll up his sleeves. I'm just going to take a break to collect my voice. Hope everyone's having a good time. I'm sorry about the connection. I think it's worse because I'm using a better camera than I was before, so it's a bit worse to stream, but we'll see later if it's recorded the bits where it's skipped. I'm glad you like it. I really like this one. It's one of my favorites, and it's very trans without being about being trans, which is satisfying. Okay. Maybe you should drink something, Mr. Hearn, said Cariad, not unkindly, pouring him some of the fresh lemonade, and Porthos leaned back in his seat at the lunch table, breathing heavily. Each of the young ladies was quite physically fit. All of them did a sport or a martial art or something like it. Porthos did not exercise. He enjoyed his life far too much for all that unpleasant business. He ate well, he did pleasant, stationary work and pleasant, stationary hobbies. And when he went to gay bars, he liked to sit back and let other men sit in his lap, not join them on the dance floor. The dance had been nearly 2 hours long, and having observed it before, he had never realized exactly how much effort it expected of its participants. He fancied it was far more fast-paced, sparkling, clapping on every second beat when he wasn't dancing into the ring with them. His thighs and his calves ached, not to mention his chest, and he looked doubly, or perhaps quadruply, ridiculous, sitting at the end of the table, sweating his organs out through his skin, when the actual brides were carrying, at worst, a healthy glow in their cheeks. Roberta hadn't even broken a sweat, and all four of them were being kind enough not to laugh at him. They were each smiling with varying degrees of amusement, except for Cariad, who was looking at him with sufficient consternation. Porthos worried he looked like he was about to drop dead, which he probably, his heart beating fast in his chest. He was breathing heavily, raggedly, and when he drank greedily. Can't win, Mr. Hearn. Porthos laughed, although it made his chest hurt even worse. You were very sweet, he said. But I'm afraid, unlike you ladies, I haven't made preparations for the next 3 months to walk around making the ground sprout with flowers underneath my feet or encouraging people to pregnancy. I should be happier losing than winning. He's picked you out, said Rosalind, looking quietly upset. Something about you that appeals more than us. Perhaps it's the hair on my chest, Porthos said Porthos dryly, and Roberta and Penelope laughed. Rosalind seemed distantly upset by that, and poor Cariad looked baffled. Porthos smiled and ate a little more. He didn't know it was for better or worse that he wasn't able to watch the other conversations. He was last in the running when Mrs. Carpathian picked their names out of a hat, and sitting inside the tent they'd lunched in, which was enchanted to keep out the noise from outside, all they could do was look out of the windows at the conversations as they unfolded. The film of the transparent cloth was too thick for them to read either of their lips, according to Penelope, although Porthos had never tried to read lips in his life and wouldn't know where to start, even if they could, with the Lord of the Woods circling around and matching steps with the bride in the ring with him. You could rarely see both of their mouths at once. What you could see, Porthos found out, was when the Lord of the Wood made them cry. Rosalind, to his surprise, remained calm and cool throughout, and while he thought he saw Cariad's mask slip once or twice, anger showing through over her innocence, she didn't cry either. It was Roberta that surprised him. She left the ring before the Lord of the Wood told her to, sobbing into her hands. Penelope, of course, left the Lord of the Wood stock still in the ring himself, unable to move his feet and staring at her. She'd obviously said something to stop him short, although what, it would be impossible to know until after. He was once again aware of everyone staring at him when he went outside, although he knew from experience that most people were too far away to actually hear what passed between the Lord and his... Porthos supposed it was wrong to call them opponents, but nonetheless it was the word that applied. Most of what actually transpired passed between whomever was in the ring was spread about by the people who were standing closest to it, but he still felt a sort of desperate dread as he stepped inside. You needn't look so frightened, intoned the Lord of the Wood, standing still as Porthos came to mirror him. You know what they say, Lord, said Porthos. Once bitten, twice shy. I don't know that there's any need for all that, said the Lord, smiling rather brightly, and looking almost as innocent as Cariad did for a moment. I haven't bitten you yet, after all. I don't know that I like this. Porthos took a step to the right, and wondered if he was planning to make it anything like the dance. Judging by the Lord's smirking features, he was wondering the same thing. I might not let you bite me at all, seeing as you're so keen on it. You would deny me my tithe? Asked his lordship. I've paid you my tithe in full, Lord, said Porthos, and when the Lord made 3 crisscrossing steps in succession, Porthos copied him, taking care not to stumble. It was on purpose, he knew, with the point being the complicated matched steps meant to distract you from the conversation, and vice versa, and with an error made in one aspect or the other, you were meant to become nervous, meant to lose your place. I don't see why I should pay you a second. I'm your lord, aren't I? You're a lord, certainly, said Porthos. No lord particularly governs my household, I'm afraid, no matter that you might govern the land it is built on. I'd like to govern rather than a lot more than the house, said the Lord of the Wood. Or do you think its occupants might prove ungovernable? I am myself with 3 cats and a tarantula, Lord, said Porthos. I'm afraid you'll find each of us more ungovernable than the last. Perhaps I like a challenge. Perhaps you'd like to make a scene, said Porthos pleasantly, and then, just for the risk of seeing if he could, he added, I expect it pleases you to feel as though you have some relevance in people's lives, given that you don't, for the most part. It must be quite the pleasure to spread a little meat spring, reduce a few girls to tears, so at least they'll think about you, even if no one else will. The Lord of the Woods' sleekly mischievous expression dropped abruptly into a scowl, and Porthos felt himself smile before he could hold it back. Greek or Egyptian, lad, said the Lord of the Wood. I don't know what to make of you. The Greek is by the by, said Porthos, but I'm afraid no one has called us Egyptians for some 400 years, and you're only proving my point about your being out of date. Aren't your people from Egypt? From India, as it happens, having left nearly 2 millennia ago. What's the difference between Egypt and India? Asked the Lord of the Wood. Oh, only a continent, Lord, said Porthos sarcastically, made to cross his steps over one after the other in quick succession. They were moving rhythmically, but not fast, and the Lord kept taking steps forward and back, forcing him to zigzag. About 3,000 miles. Can't dance, but you know all this fanciful geography, said the Lord of the Wood. Is that all you do all day? Sit on your arse, eating cakes and studying maps? That's the long and short of it, I suppose. I fit sewing dresses in between. I don't care tremendously for cakes, though, I admit. I haven't got the greatest sweet tooth. Pies, is it? Asked the Lord of the Wood, and Porthos laughed. Come on, then, what's next? He asked. The moles on my face? The hair about my cunt? You're going to imply I gain weight from gobbling cock? The Lord of the Wood smiled at him, and for a few moments they did their two-step in silence. I rather like those moles, as it happens, said the Lord of the Wood. As you like that I have moles? Mummer's farce, repeated the Lord of the Wood, and performed 6 steps in quick succession that Porthos had to hop to mimic. Now who's being old-fashioned? Perhaps you're rubbing off on me, my lord. Perhaps I'd like to, said the Lord. Perhaps I'd let you, said Porthos, and he stepped before the Lord could, taking zigzagging steps backward. The Lord, yes, but I'm not about to do your work for you. Did you agree because you're a slattern? Asked the Lord of the Wood pleasantly. To join in the ceremonies, I mean. No, my being a slattern is more a coincidence than anything else, said Porthos. I agreed because I want all these nice people to keep commissioning dresses from me, and if I'd said no, I might have dashed my chances of that. But if you want to talk about reasons, why don't we? You've picked, of all people, a 30-year-old fat gay Roma dressmaker to make sport of. Aren't you worried that makes you look particularly savage as a relic of a bygone era, even more so than the usual? You've missed one out, said the Lord of the Wood. Aren't you a gender something or other, or a sex change? Porthos couldn't help but laugh at that. Tipping his head back, the Lord of the Wood was watching him raptly, fascinated with him as he'd just done a somersault. Well, he said, may you call it something, that's all. Transgender, Lord, said Porthos. The word is transgender. You kept your womb, though. It's a jar on my mantle, said Porthos. The Lord of the Wood's face fell. Is it? He asked, horrified. No, said Porthos patiently. It's where it's always been, somewhere in my guts. I had top surgery, that's what we call a mastectomy. But I don't much want to go 2 months without sex for the sake of whipping my uterus out. And, thanks to the grace of the gods, I've not been pregnant yet. What's a mastectomy? Asked the Lord of the Wood. Strip my and you'll find out, said Porthos. Lord. Do be careful, said the Lord of the Wood, and bowed at the waist, signalling the end of their conversation, and Porthos bowed in kind. I might take you up. And he couldn't actually pull the smile off his face. As he came to pour himself more lemonade, Mrs. Carpathian met him with a horrified expression on her face. To Porthos's surprise, she touched his arm, squeezing the upper part of his shoulder. Are you all right? She asked him concerned, and he laughed. Yes, I think so, he said. Why wouldn't I be? I've seen a lot of him in 20 years, she said. I've never seen him quite like that. Well, have you ever seen him have that conversation with a man before? A fat man, a trans man, a rom? Well, no, she said. What does he say to fat girls? Well, we don't usually give him fat girls, said Mrs. Carpin, and Porthos arched an eyebrow. Well, we don't go to great pains to exclude them. They just don't come up. Well, I'm sorry if it upsets you to point it out, Mrs. Carpathian, said Porthos, but I rather had his lordship eating out of my hand. Perhaps he wants a bit more variety in his diet. Is that what you are, Mr. Hearn? Asked Mrs. Carpathian, her sweet concern replaced immediately by the usual dour nastiness. Vegetables as a source of iron and vitamins? Perhaps it's the case that I am, said Porthos, and sipped at his drink. That evening, Porthos laid in the comfortable bed in his caravan, playing with a wooden puzzle toy as Sam sat beside him. I'd usually suck your cock, he said idly, turning a dial on the toy and listening for the click. But it seems improper, given the circumstances. You think it'd ruin your chances of victory? Asked Sam. If I thought that, I'd suck it twice and Sam gave him a disapproving look. He'd come in so that Porthos could fix a tear in the cuff of his trousers, which Porthos had done in short order, but he'd stayed so that they could share a bottle of summer ale between them. Don't know how you can be so little afeard of him, said Sam, clucking his tongue in disapproval. Do you want me to tell you a secret about wrangling divinity, Sam? Asked Porthos. I don't know them secrets is for the likes of me, said Sam, or you, for that matter. The thing is, Sam, so long as you're not too arrogant about it, they rather like someone not to be afraid of them from time to time. When you have that much power, it can be pleasing to be made sport of for some of them. I never known you to be arrogant about anything, said Sam, and Porthos grinned at him. Shan't touch you, he said, but I'll put it if you like. Sam shifted in his seat, and Porthos watched the look on his face, the twist of his lips, the way he pressed his knees together. Is that right? He asked. Certainly is, said Porthos pleasantly. You tell me where to put my hands and my fingers, darling, and I'll let you puppet me through. All right, said Sam, thoughts of loyalty to his lordship apparently abandoned with this rise in libido, and Porthos grinned and unbuttoned his shirt. It was a sort of Wendy house, made of woven flowers around a wooden frame with a thickly leaved roof. He'd never seen the inside of any of them before. When he closed the door behind him, he was surprised to find the ceiling higher than he expected. It was simply appointed with real furniture, a double bed to one side, a basin to the other, and at the fore a round table with two chairs, in which one, the Lord of the Wood, was sitting. It was a little past 11. Roberta had barely lasted 5 minutes in the house before she'd run out crying. Penelope had left with her cheeks slightly dark from blushing. Her lips quirked in a little smile after 40 minutes. Cariad had left laughing after nearly an hour. Rod had cried this time, but it hadn't been for very long. The Lord of the Wood was leaning back in his seat. One elbow leaned against the back of the chair. One ankle rested on the back of his knee. Tea? He asked. Please, said Porthos, sitting across from him. And the Lord didn't pick up the teapot, but gestured with 2 fingers, making it levitate to pour for him. I know it's not my right to demand an explanation, said Porthos mildly, but I certainly would like to ask. This has all been rather unorthodox, even for a god in his domain. The Lord of the Wood sighed as Porthos picked up his cup of tea, taking a sip. It was a fresh tea, brewed with local nettles and honeysuckle, and Porthos smiled slightly at the taste of it, unexpected, but not too sweet. You can call me Jack if you like. Oh, said Porthos. Well, in that case, Jack it is. You're a very queer thing, said Jack, swilling the tea in his mug. I've been watching you since the first year you came here. You were different then. Or, but you didn't see it as important. Wore that tweed suit, and I liked it very much on display. Porthos took this in, staring into his teacup for a few moments. He was smiling again, he was aware. You pretended not to know who I was, said Porthos, and now you tell me that for half a decade you've been watching me and admiring my outfits. Not just that, said Jack. I like it when you fuck the stable hands. You keep them well in hand and they go to such lengths to fuck you, stupid. So they do, said Porthos. I like to have them well. Do you watch all the fucking that goes on in your wood? Asked Porthos. What I think of you is lord of perversion. I like your tattoos, said Jack. All those gods you worship. How do you remember their names? Tattooing them on me helps me to remember, said Porthos. Better than a mnemonic. That earned him a grin and a thoughtful expression. It's not only the fucking I'm interested in, you know. And you were pointing on such a show last night. The Lord of the Wood was rocking back in his seat, only two of its legs on the ground, and he was playing one wave of brown hair around his fingers. Do you know why I picked you as my fifth, Porthos? To make some statement or other, I suppose, said Porthos. One gets the impression you were trying to make some ripples in the committee, or perhaps just put them out of joint. Noses could do with some disjointing, said Jack coolly, and Porthos managed to suppress his smile at that, despairingly. These fine little things with no life under their belt, half of them virgins. I mean, a virgin. What am I supposed to do with it? My picking a bride isn't for the purposes of collecting innocence. The ritual of which I am a part, they're meant to all be in good fun. There isn't much of that when every girl they've sent me is likely to be terrified of my cock. You do put it so romantically, said Porthos wryly, and Jack laughed through the many gaps in that leafy ceiling and flowered walls, and his lips shone. Is that why, then? Because I'm not liable to be frightened of whatever you've got in your trousers? You're everything the committee shy away from, said Jack. I don't care for all this nonsense they have, all this drama. I want some variety, like you were saying to Coralie. The point is to meet 5 different young ladies selected almost at random. There's no point in it if they send me 3 of one girl and 2 of another each year, all of them the same shape, the same colour, the same girl. Choice, then. I don't know what that means, said Jack. But I didn't poison it. I would very much like to fuck you till you can't walk, if you'd be amenable. Oh, I would be, of course, said Porthos. Say that bit again about poisoning Lavinia Picard. The Lord of the Wood pouted out his lips. They won't last forever, he said. Only a day or 2, and she was the most boring of the 5, dull as a post, and a virgin besides. I expect you could fuck me now if you liked. But sometimes the fun is in the waiting. Don't you agree? No, said Porthos. I believe in instant gratification, since more. When the shine of the wood came down from the gap in the canopy above their heads, it crowned the head of young Penelope, and Porthos slumped in relief, laughing to himself as everyone came to dance around her and crown her head. What do you look so pleased about? Asked Mrs. Carpathian as he came to sit with her and Sam, and Porthos dropped himself heavily onto Sam's knees, curling a hand in his hair and pulling him to kiss his neck, which Sam obediently did, and then nipped behind his ear, just as Porthos liked. Oh, I'm pleased for my carpets, that's all, said Porthos happily. What the fuck are you talking about? She asked, and he laughed, pulling Sam's hand to wrap around his middle and squeeze. Nothing, said Porthos, watching as Penelope took her crown of flowers and came to kiss her spring husband. Nothing at all. Later that spring, no doubt as Penelope herself walked down the streets making flowers bloom under her heels and spurring all the time off his work to go for, of all things, a hike, his front or on his side. Porthos returned home a week later, still with twigs and leaves sticking out of his mussed and messy hair, walking bow-legged and with a cheerful limp, and thought to himself that he just might like to get a new tattoo. An oak tree, he thought, would be nice. Finn. Oh, hope everyone had a good time. I can't say recommend. Steroids for the inhaler, for anyone who didn't see me take my inhaler earlier. So, there you go. I hope you enjoyed. That one is one of my favourites, as I say. And yeah. And if you want to come along next week, I'll probably put a poll. Thinking I might do Warden Gordon and the Angel of the Wood, and maybe of the, depending, because that one's about 6,000 words, and then the Lost Boy in Llathlug is about 20 minutes, I think. So I might do those like one after the other, like with a break between. Because this was 10,000, so nice mix. Yes, perseverance before God. Yeah, because I like him very much. And when I do more in Llathlug, when I do more like in the campground Lashen, and is in like Llathlug territories, it's up in those mountains, and so is that horror story about the masks. That's also in Llathlug forest. So that all relates to national park. And there'll be more stuff with Perseverance Before God and Warden Gordon in that area, which is really, really fun to play with. Different perspective on the way different stories intersect, especially like the tweetfic that hasn't yet been adapted into prose, and then the prose, and then, you know, when I have more books, because at the moment it's just Heart of Stone, but Powder and Feathers will be out later this year, and maybe an Uncommon Betrothal, depending on how quickly I get that done. But yeah. If there's a particular story you were hoping I editor, love my editor. They're wonderful. And what was I going to say? Ali, are you in the chat? Because I can't remember your username. Wait a second, maybe I can. What's carrot browsing? I don't know what that is. I'll link Alabaster's coffee link on Twitter. But in the meantime,